Okay, back to Daniel chapter 3. Last week, last time we looked at Daniel, we did the first 3 verses, and it's pretty basic. Nebuchadnezzar made the golden image. Then they called everybody, all the politicians, all the people to come to the plain in Dura to assemble before the idol. So even the demonstration of the power of God could not override Nebuchadnezzar's unbelievable ego. The man was an egomaniac, and I believe when Daniel started telling him that dream, it just all went to his head, and the building of this idol is the result. And by the way, it's 60 cubits by 6 cubits. Interesting indication to us because the Babylonians used a different type of mathematics system. It's called the sexagesimal system, all based on sixes. So this is really a cool discovery, and it kind of makes sense why we see all these sixes in it. And then it was on the plain of Dura, and that's what it said in verse 1. And it's just south of Babylon, about 6 miles southeast. Now, Wolvord stated Nebuchadnezzar may have regarded the image as a representing himself as the embodiment of divine power, and the worship of the image would then be a recognition of his personal power. In view of his pride, as dealt with in chapter 4 later, this becomes a plausible explanation. So then he calls all the king's men, all of them, to come and assemble, everybody from his enchanters all the way down to local provincial leaders. And they're going to do some kind of swearing of a solemn oath to Nebuchadnezzar. And with that, we noted that this form of government was indeed an absolute monarchy. Nebuchadnezzar had all power. So let's move forward. Verses 4 through 6. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the hornpipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and all kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up, and whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace." So this is similar to Revelation 7, 9, and 10, peoples, nations, languages. So it was just a common form of address to speak of a conglomerate of people. And so it's used here in this chapter, and again it will be used in chapter 4, people, nations, and languages. Now in verse 1, it's used again. I think it's in chapter 6. It's just sort of a common way of addressing any conglomerate or assembly of people. And that means at the precise moment he wants absolute submission, absolute precision at every exacting moment. That's why it said, when you hear, when we do this, when it plays. Now, Robert Johann Koldewey, he was a German archaeologist, did tons of excavations near the city of Babylon and in modern-day Iraq. Koldewey's excavations of Babylon at the turn of the century also gave some evidence of the musical instruments in use in Babylon during this time period, including the terracotta figures discovered by Koldewey were representations of individuals playing the lute, tambourine, harp, the kithara, and the double reed pipe. The Greeks had an influence on Babylonia earlier than Daniel's time. There were various wind and stringed instruments. The Babylonians seem to have been a very musically crazed culture. Psalm 137, for there our captors demanded of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. Then Isaiah 14, your pomp and the music of your harps have been brought down to Sheol. Maggots are spread out as your bed beneath you, and worms are your covering. So the power of music in worship settings, especially involving a large crowd, cannot be overstated. It seems man was made with a God-given propensity to respond to music, especially when used in the service of worship. So here's those statements. You can see false worship, Daniel 3:5, the dedication of this statue. And then Isaiah 5, a drunken party, and we'll see it then later in Daniel chapter 5. And then true worship, Psalm 150, then 1 Chronicles 15, 2 Samuel 6, gives all those examples. Now, Clarence Larkin stated, all men are religious by nature and are easily carried away by anything that stirs their religious feelings. Knowing this, Nebuchadnezzar took advantage of it. Everything was done to excite and stir the religious emotions of that vast multitude on the plain of Dura. Large orchestras with their various musical instruments were stationed at convenient places. All the paraphernalia and ritualistic ceremony of idolatrous worship, with the most gorgeous display of religious trappings, such as were used by the Babylonian cults, were doubtless used to impress the bystanders and get them to worship the image. So it's kind of similar to stuff that goes on in our day. And Christians need to show discernment about this stuff. Worship leaders, congregants need to ensure the music we offer in praise is biblically informed rather than serving to bypass our mental faculties in favor of unrestrained emotion. That indeed is a danger. Lacking such discernment, we can easily fall prey to emotional manipulation, even offering unbiblical expressions of worship before God. Charlie Klaus stated, music is the international language. Music would be perfectly understood no matter what language you spoke. So music becomes the international language, and it is music that is the tool of conveying the command to worship. Music is viewed as a manipulation, in other words. Music still is being used as a manipulation device. And the Christian, when he performs, when he writes, when he composes, ought to be very careful that he is not using his music to manipulate. Music is an aid to worship, but it doesn't deliberately try to put thoughts in one's mind. So it shouldn't be like that. And he goes on, and so music today is used in most churches as a manipulative tool to get people into a certain mindset, a certain emotive state, which is identified as worship. If you just didn't reach that state, then you didn't worship. It has nothing to do with the content of the teaching and the content of biblical instruction that has come out of the pulpit. But worship has to do with obedience to the authority of God, submission to God, and learning does and applying it in our lives. So here's another verse. They have lyre and harp, tambourine and flute, and wine at their feast, but they do not regard the deeds of the Lord or see the work of his hand. Now that's a telling verse right there. So he's basically just saying, don't do that. Now, Nebuchadnezzar has really got this big ego going on. He's got the whole nation gathered. all the dignitaries called in the royal orchestra. They're all ready to go. And when they hit their cue, everybody is supposed to bow down to his massive image. Now, the ceremony illustrates the well-worn path of totalitarian leaders who prostitute religion in the service of egotistical political aspirations. He is one of many in the line, extending from Nimrod, and it will go all the way to the Antichrist. And if not, the music, as it worked upon the emotions, was intended to draw men to worship this visually impressive image, whereas the threat of the furnace was intended to overcome any reluctance. Like it said in verse 6, and whoever falls not down and worships shall the same hour be cast into the middle of a burning fiery furnace. And oh, by the way, smelting furnaces were often built on a hillside or man-made mound, enabling easy access to the top. So by their vertical orientation and the attachment of bellows, temperatures in these types of kilns could reach as high as 1,000 degrees centigrade, and that's about 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Jeremiah reveals Nebuchadnezzar's reputation for using fire as a means of capital punishment. Here it is in chapter 29. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says about Ahab, son of Koliah, and Zedekiah, son of Messiah, who are prophesying lies to you in my name. I will hand them over to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and he will put them to death before your very eyes. Because of them, all the exiles from Judah who are in Babylon will use this curse. The Lord treat you like Zedekiah and Ahab, whom the king of Babylon burned in the fire. There it is. So anybody who refuses to bow constitutes a treasonous act and will be thrown into the fiery furnace. Now, if you're standing in opposition to the greatness of Nebuchadnezzar, that's it. That's all for you. Now, verse 7, therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the hornpipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the people, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So, it is kind of like politically correctness today. Most people respond to external circumstances and external pressure. They conform to whatever is required of them rather than internal principle. That's kind of standard as she wrote. Now, this is kind of a typical approach to life. You do whatever you need to do to get whatever you need to get, living on the lowest level, compromising internal principle based on external pressure. Men invariably bow to the system. They bow to the powers that be. They do whatever they have to do, afraid to lose their position, and so they compromise. Do what you're told and everything will be all right, is basically what they're being told. Verse 8, therefore at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. It's kind of the nana boo boo moment. The Chaldeans had been kind of the mainstay of Babylonian culture and hierarchy. But when these three young men had shown such great character, and when Daniel had been able to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream, both Daniel and his three friends got elevated to very high places. It's very likely that they were even set above the Chaldeans, and they didn't like it. Earlier in chapter 2, then Daniel requested of the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king. So Daniel was given, we could say, like the post of prime minister. The other three were placed in the leadership of Babylon. So they had been elevated, and the Chaldeans resented this. They were angry about it. And to the point, it was anti-Semitism. Accused is from the Aramaic word to consume, denounce, accuse, formally to chew to pieces, implying a formal legal charge. So this is kind of political dirty business. And it was full of malicious intent. So there is no indication that Nebuchadnezzar harbored anti-Semitic feelings, yet it seems difficult to avoid the anti-Semitic implications of the subsequent statement of their accusers. Those who refused to worship could have been described as certain individuals or certain leaders or certain men, but it was their identity as Jews that the accusers emphasized when describing their behavior. So again, in essence, it's demonic. I think also we have to remember the Chaldeans were energized by Satan, for they were basically the priests of the god known as Bel-Merodach, who was the main god, Bel being similar to the form we know as Baal. And so they saw their chance, energized by Satan through their own false religious system, to tear into these young Hebrews. Now, Whitcomb noted in his commentary, compare the later accusations against Daniel in chapter 6, and still later, the wild and inflammatory charge by Haman against all Jews in Esther. Behind all such anti-Jewish movements throughout history, of course, looms Satan himself. Satan knew that through this divinely chosen people would come the Messiah of Israel and the Savior of mankind. And that's even noted in Romans and in Revelation. Then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren who accuses them before our God day and night has been cast down. There it is. Satan is behind that stuff. And you have to say that makes sense. Verse 9, they declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. So hypocritically, they spoke to the king as if they were defending him, gave him all that flowery language. We're really here, king, just to assure you of our commitment. So they were envious of the high positions of these Jewish boys, and they were still. This was early on in the captivity in Babylon. So they wanted to do all they could to change that, but they came on very hypocritical. Verse 10, you, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound, and they go through the whole thing again of all the instruments, shall fall down and worship the golden image. So, the whole deal, it's another repetition, but this kind of gives credence to what's going on. Verse 11, and whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. So they're reminding Nebuchadnezzar, this is what you said. So you remember. And they're real accurate. They're verbatim of what the king said. They reiterated the standard, and then they revealed the real issue in the next verse. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon. So see, there you go. That's one of the things that's kind of stuck on them. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So it's kind of stuck in their craw. Certain Jews. That is what really aggravates them, that these captive Hebrews would be over them. And they are envious. So these are slaves. These are imported hostages, foreigners. And you've made rulers out of them. They rule over us. That's what really gets them. And you get a little bit of the insight of that appalling sin of envy. Proverbs 14, a heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones. Now, this is kind of a reminder of King Saul. He had been a great king, anointed of God to be the Lord's witness. But because of the sin of envy, Saul's life degenerated into utter uselessness. 1 Samuel, and the woman answered one another as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. This really got to Saul. This was only a song, but it awakened in his heart the wicked passion of envy. Okay, from Song of Solomon, set me as a seal on your heart, as a seal on your arm, for love is strong as death. Jealousy is as cruel as Sheol. So jealousy and envy, they're like acid. It corrodes the soul. It destroys the beauty of the soul, like a grave destroys the beauty of the body. And they were being consumed by the sin of envy. And so they bring this to the king's attention. Now notice that they accuse them of three things in verse 12. One in the middle of the verse. First of all, they haven't regarded you. So we could say they have disregarded the king. No attention. They haven't responded to you. They haven't given you your due. Now, technically, that's not true. They had unquestionably fulfilled their responsibility to the king insofar as it didn't violate their responsibility to God. Just like this verse in Matthew, Jesus says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. And they were doing that to Nebuchadnezzar, and to God the things that are God's. They were good citizens. They had responded to the king. Go back to chapter 1 and you find out that they had given the king his due. Then, second, the two accusations were true, that's other two. They do not serve your gods. So it's basically monotheism versus polytheism, or worship the golden image. They were not idolaters. So these young men knew the price of disobedience, and if you have to ask yourself, how could anybody put principles so high that they would literally stand there while the entire mass of humanity there went down? They would stand there resolute, ready to walk into that fiery furnace. Now that, you have to tell yourself, is true character. Their destiny was in his hands. They left it to God. Resisting Nebuchadnezzar would be utterly useless. They have no other resource. Future advancement in their careers in Babylon were absolutely dependent upon their allegiance to Nebuchadnezzar. They could have said to themselves, this idol really isn't anything, so why do we worry about it? We'll just kneel down like everybody else does. But then we'll go pray to our true God. Well, they could have said everybody's doing it, but they didn't. They could have said, well, you know, the fire tends to be fatal, and if we're dead, we're not very useful to God. We're in this strategic place, so we better do what we need to do to stay here. Well, they were uncompromising. There were lots of things that could have come to bear upon them as pressures. But in spite of all of this, they were resolute and absolutely uncompromising. It's amazing the situation they were in to take such a firm stand, and especially at their age. Now, have you ever noticed, though, egomania can't stand one person that doesn't conform. One person is all it takes to make them literally livid, let alone three. And so Nebuchadnezzar was never satisfied with everybody but three. Megalomaniacs are never satisfied with anything less than everybody, period. So, how do we know that? Well, we will read on and we will address that the next time.